It's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. So we have what seems to be a crowded agenda for today. I'm going to return to some ethics and some history. And then after the break, we're going to talk about applications and the reasons why you would want to do the things that we're going to do over the next 3 weeks. Things we're going to do over the next 3 weeks are putting a price on things that are not traded on any market, at least not explicitly. So I'm going to spend today talking about why you would want to do this, in order, including what is value. And then the next 2 weeks we're going to talk about actual methods for doing so. There's little methods today before or after the break. What you've noticed on Canvas is that this used to be lecture 7, and what used to be lecture 7 is actually marked as lecture 4. The reason for this is AI. We had to change the structure of the essay. It used to be that you guys would write an essay about your favorite regulation and whether or not it worked. But that is not robust to AI. This sort of stuff is robust to AI. So the essay will be a valuation exercise. Now it is a bit early to start doing this, but I did post the essay question this morning on Canvas, just so that you get an idea of what it will be like and what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks. You haven't had a chance to read this, but tomorrow and Wednesday you will have had a chance, so I will start the seminar by giving you the opportunity to ask questions about the essay, right? And what is expected and what to do. Okay? So, but today we're gonna not talk about that. We're gonna instead start talking about what is value. And this is actually a very important question in economics. Patterson went as far as to say that the theory of value is the core, the theoretical core of every major school of economic thought. That is definitely true. And it is important that you understand this because it's actually not easy to understand. You sort of like seen glimpses of this, but perhaps not fully. The history of the theory of value actually goes back to Plato, or as my American friends call him, Plato. Really it is a T that is in there, not a D. Plato noted that the value in use can be very different from the value in exchange. That what you pay for something at the market can be very, very different from how valuable it is to you. Perhaps the most important distinction here, or the most important illustration for this, is the difference between water and diamonds. Definitely in Plato's time and in Aristotle's time, water was free. You just went to the stream and you took some water and you drank it. It was free. Nowadays water is pretty cheap. It's not recommended that you go and drink water from the stream. Definitely don't do that in England because there's lots of stuff there that you are not robust to. And also if you have not grown up on raw water, which I think very few of you have, it is very, very, very dangerous. Even if you go up high in the mountains, there's giardia in the water and that will kill you, unless you have drank that sort of water from a very young age. But water is very cheap, right? Diamonds are very expensive. Now, you can't survive without water for more than 2 days. Regardless of what your girlfriend might tell you, you can live without diamonds, right? They are essentially useless. They're decoration, or that's what they use. There's lots of industrial applications of diamonds nowadays, but diamonds used to be purely for decoration. So diamonds you can do without, water you can't do without. So the value in use of water is very high. The value in use of diamonds is very low. The price of diamonds is very high. The price of water is very low. And this was a paradox, right? And this used to be a paradox, and it was a paradox for almost 3,000 years, at least for the documented history of 3,000 years, and perhaps people worried and wondered about this for a much longer period. And people like Plato and Aristotle really did not know what to do with this, right? They did have a theory of the value of exchange, and that this was determined in the short run by supply and demand. You can find this in the works of Aristotle. You can find this in the works of this must be Augustine. You can find it in the works of Thomas Aquinas, all the way through both ancient history, medieval history, up to the early modern period. People really wondered what to do, but they did realize that there was such a thing as a value in exchange, but they did not know how to explain this other than what a fool might pay for whatever you put on the market, right? And there was no clear developed theory of this. There was a very clearly developed and strongly articulated theory of the value in use. And as so many things, this goes back to Aristotle. Here you see him depicted. And Aristotle argued that the value in use is what it should be worth. And the word should is important here. And then Aristotle, being a philosopher, argued that it's us deep thinkers who determine what the value in use of something should be. It is based on ethical principles, it's based on moral principles, it's based on philosophical principles. Now you may think this is a bit strange, that why would a group of deep thinkers set the value of anything? It is important to note that in ancient Athens, the government actually had a very big role in the market. They subsidized food, they subsidized housing, they distributed jobs. So the government was a very important player in most markets. And that government needed to be guided in making the right decisions. And for that, you need to know the value of things about which you're making decisions, right? So this was not an abstract question, but this was really an applied political economy question. What should the government do? And Aristotle said that government should maximize value, and value is what we philosophers say something is worth. That changed later. We're zooming forward in time by 800 years. And St. Augustine, here you see Augustine properly. He was a Berber, so he wasn't white as you saw in the previous slide, but he had a much darker skin. He's from North Africa, from Hippo, that's near Carthage, in what is now, I believe, Tunisia. But I don't always get my African geography right. But Augustine took a slightly different position than Aristotle. Augustine is essentially the guy who brought ancient Greek philosophy into Christianity, right? That is his main contribution. So he adopted Aristotle's position, but with a twist. He said, value is not what Aristotle thinks it is worth, but value is what God thinks it's worth. And it's not philosophy that sets the intrinsic value, but it is theology that sets the intrinsic value. Now, this is a subtle difference. I don't think it's much of a difference, because in this case, it's old man telling you what is valuable and what is not. Here, it seems to be that God is telling you what is valuable or what is not, but God doesn't speak to us, right? And it is what old man say that God says, right? So in both cases, it's old man telling you what to think, essentially. There's no, I hope I'm not insulting anybody. This is essentially the same, but at one remove, right? The old man now hide behind a sacred, or what they call a sacred text. But here, as well as here, the value in use is something that is absolute, driven by moral principles, by ethical rules, by interpretations of a holy text. It is something that is absolute, right? We can move another 800 years forward in time. Thomas Aquinas, the sort of the late great thinker about these matters in the ancient tradition. And Aquinas essentially, I mean, he did many things, but on this question, he essentially said the same thing as Augustine, who essentially said the same thing as Aristotle, right? So this is all about the value in use, and they had no idea whatsoever how to relate this to the price, right? And I'll get back to that. Things changed some 400 years later when William, not Tom Petty, wrote that labor is the father and the active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother. And this is still the value in use, but Petty no longer says it's God or the Bible or the Quran or ancient philosophy. Really, value in use is driven by land and labor. And he was the first to do this, but people very quickly forgot about what Petty had to say. Because a little bit later, well, again, we're jumping a few hundred years in time, the physiocrats, led by Quenet, said, it's land. Forget about labor. The value of something is determined by the amount of land that is embedded in this something. Why did Quenet say this? And does it deviate from what Augustine and Aquinas said? Not really, because Quenet argued that values are driven by God's will, but we cannot really observe what God wants or what he does, except through the laws of nature, which are an expression of God's will. And our closest connection with labor, with nature, is in agriculture. Right? That is where human society touches nature. That is where human society touches God. And therefore, croplands are valuable. And the labor of farmers is productive. It generates value. And everything else that is going on in the economy is parasitic on this particular value. So Quenet said Quenet's theory of value is that it's all about land. And land is the only thing that is valuable. And everything else, the value derives from the amount of land included in this. Now, Galbraith, much later, argued that all economic theories are self-serving or serving the powers that be. And Cannae was landed gentry, right? Everybody who had time to think was rich, right, at this time. Poor people were too busy surviving and definitely could not afford an education, right? So Cannae was a landed gentleman himself, but he also served at the royal court, right? And this was in 18th century France. It was an agricultural society. It was still a feudal society. And the source of both political and economic power lay in holding large tracts of land, right? So him saying this very much served his master, Louis XIV, right? The Sun King. That's what he argued. Little bit later, Adam Smith came along, and this is a quote from Smith. If among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer. And this is the labor theory of value. That the value of something, the worth of something, is determined not by the amount of land that is embedded in something, or not what an ancient philosopher or a long dead saint said about something. It is how much work you put in that drives the value of a good or service. Smith was not the first to say this, but he was the first to say this in Europe. Long before Ibn Khaldun had written something very, very similar, but in Arabic, and nobody in Europe could read Arabic, so this wasn't noticed until much later. Smith's theory of labor theory of value was refined by David Ricardo, who did much, much more than international trade, and further refined by Karl Marx. And of course, it's the Marxian interpretation of the Smithian and Ricardian theory of value that sort of like completely messed up the former Soviet Union and the early stages of communist China, right? But they thought value is an absolute thing. It is determined by the amount of work that goes into something. There's other theories of value. I won't go into this. Judisco Rogan and later Constanzino Doom said no, value is driven by the amount of energy that is contained in this. This has been largely abandoned by now. This particular theory of value, due to Bill Rees and Matthias Wackernagel, who you see here at the bottom, they have returned to a land theory of value. And in the final week, we're going to talk about the ecological footprint. But essentially what the ecological footprint does is it expresses anything we do in its land equivalent. And Wackernagel in particular has returned to a physiocrat's theory of value. So even though I said, well, this happened in the 18th century, it actually was revived late in the 20th and is alive and well in the 21st century. So what do these things have in common? That the value in use is set by some absolute yardstick. It can be ethics and morals, it can be religion, it can be land, it can be labor, it can be energy. But there is some sort of absolute notion of what something is worth. Returning to the value in exchange, the price, if you can buy something at a cost that is different from its true value, then the implication is that the market is immoral, right? The market is wrong. Because prices are wrong, prices are set by the market. If they deviate from the true value, that is because there's something wrong with the market and we must intervene in this. This is what most people throughout history, still many people today, think, right? The classical economists, of course, took a different position. They said that because the market, the invisible hand, sort of delivers a Pareto optimum, what we now call a Pareto optimum, the market is moral. That is, the market delivers what it should deliver. So there's a very strong discrepancy here between most philosophers, most theologians, and a lot of other people throughout history, including a lot of economists, think that the market is inherently wrong. Classical economists argue that the market is inherently right. Very strong difference between the two. Now that is what people used to think about value. That is what still a lot of non-economists, most economists think about value. And unfortunately also a lot of economists think about value. But then along came the neoclassical revolution and everything changed. Problem with the neoclassical revolution is that unlike, say, Bohr's theory of how atoms work, the general public does not understand this, right? Now, what did the neoclassical revolutionaries argue? Here we see the three. This is the three main ones. This is Jevons, this is Walras. So this must be Menger, right? And they abandoned the notion that value in use is an absolute thing. They said value is relative. And in doing so, they argued that the value in exchange, what you pay for it at the market, is equal to the value in use at the margin. And that is how they reconciled the two different concepts of value. Value in exchange is the price, value in use at the margin is the same thing. And the reason that water is cheap, that the price is low, the value in exchange is low, even though the value in use is high, it's so abundant that at the margin water is actually not that useful, right? I mean, if you would be without water, you would be in deep, deep problems. But for an additional glass of water, you would not pay a lot, right? Because it's not very, it's not much worth to you. Similarly, the reason that diamonds are expensive is because there are so very few of them, right? Or there used to be very few of them. We got much better at digging them up, and of course now we can make diamonds in factories. There's a whole bunch of important implications of this. One is the notion of consumer sovereignty. That is, as economists, we take the utility function of people as given. And we don't quibble with somebody's preferences. We try to measure their preferences, and that's what we're going to do in the next 2 weeks. We try to measure people's preferences, but we're not, like philosophers, tell them what those preferences should be, right? Or not like priests, we don't tell them how they should think. We just say, well, this is what people appreciate, so this is what I've got to stick in my utility function, which is simply a representation of people's preferences, right? Talk about this tomorrow, that utility function is knowable only up to an affine transformation, which means that we don't have an absolute measure of utility. We only have a representation of their preferences, but we can't say whether your utility is 10 or 100. That is a meaningless statement. The implication of this is that in neoclassical theory, the market is amoral. That is, the market simply reflects people's utility functions, people's preferences. And they may be all very nice people, and then the market will do nice things. They may all be very nasty people, and then the market will do nasty things. But the market itself just reflects people's preferences. The market itself is not moral or amoral, is not moral or immoral. The market is amoral. That is, it has no moral stance, right? You can quibble with this, but this is basically what these guys and their followers argued. The implication of this is that values depend on context, depend on supply and demand, value in use, then also, because it is at the margin, depends on supply and demand. It depends on culture, custom, and taste. The best example, I think, is due to Darius the Great, Shah and Shah, the king of kings of the old Persian Empire, one of the first. This was an empire, right? And the definition of an empire is that it includes many nations, many different people. And some of the subjects of Darius were Greeks. And the ancient Greeks buried their dead even, when at home, and they cremated their dead when on either travel for commerce or travel for military reasons, right? So that is what they did. And Darius, being a curious man, wondering about all these different subjects and all the different cultures and all the different languages and all the different customs, asked those Greeks, how much should I give you in gold if you would not cremate your dead? Because they were obviously in Persia and not in Greece. But how much would I give you to eat your dead relatives? And the Greeks were absolutely horrified and say, you can't compensate us enough in gold. All the gold in the world would not get us to eat our dead comrades. He then turned around to another group that was at the court at the time, a group from India who practiced ritualized cannibalism. That is, in order to honor their dead relatives, they ate them, which is actually used to be much more common than a lot of us think. And he turned to them and asked them, how much should I give you in gold if you would not eat your dead relatives, but you would cremate them? And they were just as horrified as the Greeks at this this suggestion, because this was absolutely no big no-no, and if you don't eat your dead father, then he will come to haunt you, and so on and so forth. This is the way of honoring your dead relatives. So values depend on culture, and so on and so forth, and those cultures can be very, 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 very different, right? And Darius realized that and said, well, we're going to leave burial practices to or the rites of the dead to whatever is used to be common in these cultures that I conquered. It is, by the way, a very bad idea to eat your dead relatives, because all sorts of nasty diseases can be transmitted if you eat their brains, so don't do that, right? If you need it convincing. But a lot of people used to do this throughout history. So values depend on context, supply and demand, but also on what a society thinks valuable and what is the custom embedded in that in the cultural norms. There are a few things, few further things that you can say. That something that is uncertain, if it's not clear what it's really going to do, then it's worth less, and of course vice versa. An uncertain loss is worth more. And of course something that is unique, something that of which there is only one, is worth more because there's no close substitute. Whereas if you drop a glass of water, you can replace it with another glass of water. So that is not particularly valuable. But if you would lose, say, a painting from Van Gogh or Picasso, that would be disastrous. Not because it's so useful, but there is only one, and people seem to like their paintings. Okay, this is the 1870s. Things were refined later by this guy Higgs, who you see here, won the Nobel Prize at a time when Nobel Prizes weren't clearly defined. It's not clear why he gave him the Nobel Prize, but they did, and he did lots of great things, so it's a bit unclear what for. Higgs distinguished between the equivalent variation and the compensating variation, or as they are more intuitively known, willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation. Willingness to pay is how much you are prepared to pay to get something that you don't have. And this is the standard situation. You go to the supermarket, you're looking for a pint of milk, and you wonder how much should I pay for a pint of milk, and the answer is 65p, right? That's a decent price for a pint of milk nowadays. So that is the willingness to pay, how much you're giving up of your income in order to get something, a pint of milk that you don't have, right? But you do want to put on your cornflakes, right? Willingness to accept compensation, or the Higgian compensating variation, the technical term, is how much you would need to be compensated if you lose something that you have, right? So you bought your pint of milk, you walk out onto the street, you drop it, or somebody walks into you and you drop it, and how much compensation would you need in order to make you whole again, right? That is the willingness to accept compensation, or the technical term, the compensating variation. And both are useful concepts of value, right? But they are different, right? One is you get something you don't have, but you give up income. Here you lose something that you do have, but you gain income, right? So that is the difference between the two, and we'll get to this in 2 weeks' time at more length. We can make this more precise. This bit you've seen, this bit you may not have seen in micro. So we have a consumer who wants to maximize utility by purchasing a bundle of consumption goods Q, but subject to a budget constraint, that is prices times quantities must be smaller than or equal to your income, right? Because you cannot buy, this is a one-shot thing, you cannot borrow, you cannot earn more money, so there is a simple budget constraint here, right? Now, this optimization problem, the primal optimization problem, implies a demand function. And that is what you've learned in micro, that the amount of stuff you want to buy is a function of your budget constraint Y and the price is P, right? And I just posit the existence of a demand function. Now, you may have learned that this is a demand function, but in actual fact, it's an ordinary demand function, or a Marshallian demand function after Marshall and Paley, right? But Paley is, of course, forgotten in this attribution. Not solving it, I'm saying there is a function that. We can plug this solution back into our utility function, U, to find the value function, which is the general term, or the specific term, the indirect utility function, which is here denoted by V. The indirect utility function is not a function like the utility function itself of the quantities, but it's in fact a function of prices and budget constraints, right? And the indirect utility function doesn't describe how your utility changes if price changes or if your income changes, but it actually re-optimizes. If income changes, then it re-optimizes your consumption bundle. If prices change, it re-optimizes your price bundle, right? So it is an optimal value function or a value function. Now, we found this thing by sticking this one in, which then, you may have guessed, implies Roy's identity, which says that the demand function, which we had here, is equal to the first partial derivative of the value function. But that doesn't work because this is utils as a function of price, and then this has price in. So we need to normalize that with the marginal value of the budget constraint, the marginal value of additional income. And now it's properly in measurable quantities again. So this is something that you recall from micro, right? Now, if you can solve a primal optimization problem, then there's also the dual optimization problem, as they told you in calculus. What is the dual of this case? Instead of maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint, we're minimizing expenditure subject to a lower bound on your utility. And the U that you get here is actually the optimal U that you get here, right? The capital U is the optimal U from there. This problem gives the same result as this problem, right? So, we want to solve this one. Minimize expenditure subject to a floor on our happiness. This implies a demand function, but not an ordinary demand function. An extraordinary demand function, you may call it, but that is not specific enough. We call this the compensated demand function, or after Hicks, and Hicks wrote without his wife, the Hicksian demand function. And the Hicksian demand function is a function of prices and utility. Not prices and income, prices and utility. If we stick this particular demand function back into our objective function here, we find the value function that is now known as the expenditure function, which essentially tells you how much you would spend on your bundle of consumption goods as a function of the prices, and these are the optimal amounts you would pay for every good and service in your consumption bundle. And then we have the equivalent to Roy's identity, but it's due to Shepard, not Roy, which says that the compensated demand function is the first partial derivative of the expenditure function to the prices. This is equivalent to here, but now note that we do not need to normalize because things are given in quantities and pounds sterling. These two things are the important ones. Demand function, ordinary demand function, compensated demand function. So, we see them here. This is our ordinary demand function. Here we have quantity, here we have price. Price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. Here we have our ordinary demand function. And the question is, what happens if price changes from P0 to P1? Things were becoming more expensive. Well, if things become more expensive, then instead of buying Q0, we buy Q1, right? And then the consumer surplus of all this is, it's all on canvas. You don't need to take pictures. You're allowed to take pictures, but if that's what you were doing, right? Is this area here, right? It's the area under the demand curve, right? That much is familiar. The compensating variation is the area under the compensated demand function. That's given here, that's this one here. And the area under the compensated demand function is this area here. The area under the we have two compensated demand functions. Go ahead.
I don't think that's on the slides.
This is, I uploaded it yesterday evening.
Oh, maybe they changed.
What did you call the slide?
This is 7. Because we changed the order. You should look at the units, not go into you guys don't have access to directly to the files, do you? I'll double check in the break or after the break to make sure that it is uploaded. But I am, and the same is true for the slides of last week and the week before.
No, it's fine before. It's just I might be looking at the place.
Okay, I'll make sure that this is up there. We have two compensated demand functions, is what I was saying. We have the compensated demand function at the original utility, U0, and we have the compensated demand function at the new utility, U1. And that determines the difference between compensating variation and equivalent variation. Compensating variation, we keep utility as it was before the price change. And then we have this particular area. This is known as the compensating variation. The area under the new demand curve with the new utility after the price change, so that is lower, right? So we shift that way. Is this area here. So what we have now established is Willich's theorem, right? That the compensating variation is greater than the consumer surplus is greater than the equivalent variation, right? This area versus this area versus this area, right? That is something we have established. We've now also established why one is called the compensating variation. Not quite why the other is called the equivalent variation, but that was just Higgs. The compensating variation makes you whole again after a loss. So utility stays as it was, right? So the price goes from P0 to P1, the price goes up. How much money should I give you so that you are just as happy as before the price change? That depends on keeping your utility as it was at U0, and the amount of money I should give you to compensate you for the increase in price is this area, right? This is the area, this is the amount that keeps your utility as it was. And that is why it's called the compensating variation, because it compensates you for the welfare loss due to a price increase, right? Equivalent variation does not have such a neat intuition. It keeps utility as it becomes, right? So now you are 60 pence poorer, but you got a pint of milk, right? So you're in the new situation where you got your pint of milk. Of course, the reasoning here is in quantities of milk rather than in prices of milk, but you can see what is going on. So we're in the new situation, and you want to keep utility as it is in the new situation, and this is then the maximum that you would be willing to pay not to obtain a pint of milk, but to guarantee that the price of milk goes from 65 pence to 60 pence, right? So that is the equivalent variation. Key difference to note is that the compensating variation keeps utility as it was. The compensating variation takes utility as it is after your purchase, right? That is why these two are different. Now, I'll talk more about Wheeler's theorem in 2 weeks' time. If we're talking about a pint of milk, right, that does not really change your utility by much. So in the graph, H of U0 and H of U1 are very far apart because otherwise you can't see it. If we are talking about something as trivial as a pint of milk, then these two are of course very, very close together, right? And this particular inequality becomes almost an equality, right? Almost, not quite. But for graphical purposes, I pull them far, far apart. Right? Okay. This is in price changes. In the book, you can read about how this relates to demand functions that are not in price changes, but in quantity changes, which requires yet more maths that I will spare you. This is a good time to take a break. Okay, let's continue. For those of you who left, I found the problem with the slides, and I will fix it soon. This is where we are. I talked about Higgs, I talked about neoclassics, and I talked for a very long time about the classics. The next 3 chapters I can go through more quickly as I should. So I'm going to talk about types of value, and the question is, how much is this worth? Now there's 2 ways of thinking through this particular problem. The first is very popular with ecologists, environmentalists, and that is essentially a service qualification. What does nature do for us? The first thing is that nature provides us with lots of stuff. So food, water, wood, fiber, biochemicals, and so on and so forth. These are called provisioning services. And then the value of something is essentially the replacement value. If we can't get nuts from the forest, how would we get protein, right? So that is fairly straightforward, right? All the good things that nature does for us. The second thing is more subtle. Those are the regulating services. So a forest is nice, and it provides wood, and it provides shelter for deer that you can hunt and eat if you're so inclined. And you can get the nuts and you can get the mushrooms. But the stream that you see here and the entire ecosystem around it also, if it rains, absorbs water. And then when it stops raining, it slowly releases that water. So it regulates the water flow. And if you were to cut down these trees, the water would come down much, much more quickly, right? So you would have a flooding problem downstream. So it regulates the flow of water. It also takes out a lot of bad stuff from the water. So that is a regulating service. Of course, it also, a forest, trees cool the place down. The shade is a form of microclimate regulation. So these things are a bit further removed, but they're definitely important to us. There are supporting services, which is a further remove, and those are such things as primary production. This is how we get our oxygen. It's a sort of crucial for us, right? Would be dead in, what is it, 5 minutes without. It also, such things as worms create soil. You may not like worms and you may not appreciate what they're doing, but they're really, really, really important. Actually, in the book there is a whole box on the value of worms and what they do to soil fertility and how that leads to cheaper food for us, right? So all these things are important. And these supporting services, really you need to understand how the ecosystem works in order to appreciate it. But of course, if you're ignorant, that does not mean that it's not important to you, right? It's just that you don't realize. So direct, one remove, two remove. Then there's cultural services. We just like the fact that whales are swimming in the sea. We like to go, some of us, like to go for a hike in the Downs, right? There's aesthetic issues. Many of us like the view of nice old majestic trees and so on and so forth. These are known as cultural services. So this classification of the value, the different kinds of value, really come from the question, what does nature, what does the environment do for us? And as you can see here, there is a long list of things that the environment does for us, because also these dots mean that you can think of other things that are going on, right? Now this is how ecologists like to do this, and by extension ecological economists. Orthodox economists, environmental economists take a slightly different route, and the classification is really through how it affects humans. And the total economic value of something is split into three things. Again, the visualization is terrible. Use values, option values, and non-use values. Use values are further split into direct and indirect. Direct is further split in consumptive and non-consumptive. Option values are split into option and quasi-option. And non-use is split into the value, the use of others, and the pure existence values. And then others can be your friends or your children. Now, it all sounds very abstract, so let's go through a concrete example of these values for a piece of woodland. So let's take a bit of rainforest. Consumptive or extractive direct use is the timber you get out, the fuel wood you get out, the nuts you get out, right? So it's direct use. You use timber to build a house, and it is extractive in the sense that you cut down the tree and it is not there anymore, right? You can also think of non-consumptive direct use. That is, you fly to Costa Rica and you go wander around the rainforest for a bit, which is a very pleasant experience, right? So that would be recreation, or an amenity if you're closer by. But you can also say, well, this satisfies my spiritual needs. I can't even say that word, it doesn't work for me, but you can imagine that there's people like that, right? Direct use of the environment, in this case, a rainforest. Using up the resource, just enjoying the fact that it's there, but directly using it. Indirect use of the rainforest is, as I said, the protection of the watershed, the regulation of the streams and the rivers that go through there. If you cut down the trees, then the soil will wash away in the next heavy downpour. And trees are carbohydrates. They essentially store lots and lots of carbon, and therefore they take CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? So they store carbon and they regulate the climate both directly, be it by the shade they provide, but also indirectly through the carbon that they store. So that would be an indirect use of the rainforest. What is an option value? An option value is simply a use value that hasn't materialized yet. So if you are in Costa Rica, the rainforest is heavily used for tourism. If you are in Panama, the rainforest tourism is very underdeveloped. But of course, the rainforest looks much the same. Flights are just as easy. So there's definitely a potential market for ecotourism in Panama, right? So that is an option value. That's simply future direct use that hasn't materialized yet. Quasi-option value is different. An option value is something that you don't use at the moment, but you're sure will give you future benefits. And we know that people like to visit a rainforest, so if you have a piece of land with rainforest on, you have an option value. Quasi-option value is also something in the future that you don't use at the moment, but you're not sure that it exists. So a famous breakthrough in the history of medicine is when they discovered this anti-malarial bark on a tree in Peru. And I think the English name is quinine, but it may be quinine. I'm never sure. Now, that is in the past. That is not a quasi-option value. But had the Spaniards be rapacious enough to cut down all the trees in Peru, which they fortunately did not do, then we would never have discovered this particular medicine, right? Similarly, if we take the rainforest in Panama, that hasn't been fully explored yet because it's wild and remote, and there's all sorts of animals and plants and trees there that we don't really fully understand. And you probably read that occasionally in the newspaper that they went to this unexplored area in Southeast Asia or somewhere in Central America, and they came up with 50 new species of frog and 100 new species of beetles that they did not know existed before, right? There are really lots of areas like that still. Now, if one of those trees in this unexplored piece of rainforest has a cure for HIV, and we cut down that forest, then we will never discover this cure for HIV, right? So having a cure for HIV would be very, very useful, right? Very, very valuable. So there's a true value there, but we don't know whether it is there or not. But you can be sure that if you destroy it, you will never discover it, right? So that is a quasi-option value. Hard to get your head around, right? Non-use values are simple. Bequest is you don't care about the rainforest, but your children might, and therefore you want to preserve it, right? Or you don't care about the rainforest, but your friends do, and therefore you want to preserve it, right? And this is fairly simple. Non-use values that are really the use of by others are just direct use values or indirect use values, and not for yourself, but people you care about. Existence values are difficult to get your head around. Definitely if you're a die-hard economist. Because that is, we take pleasure in things existing. And they found this in surveys. And we're going to talk about these surveys in 2 weeks again. But they were asking people, how much are you willing to pay to help protect this piece of the Rocky Mountains, right? We're going to create a nature reserve. That's going to cost money. Would you be willing to pay additional taxes, or would you be willing to make an annual contribution to help create and maintain this nature reserve? And this nature reserve is important because there's grizzly bears. It's basically everywhere, but there's also bighorn sheep which really only live in this part of the Rockies, and we're going to protect those bighorn sheep. And then they asked different questions about the level of protection. Going to create a nature reserve, and you can just wander in and look at all the animals, right? And how much are you willing to pay for that? Or we're going to create a stricter nature reserve, and we're going to only allow film crews in and biologists, but not the general public. And how much would you be willing to pay for that? And obviously that is lower value because you cannot directly go and see things, but people were still willing to pay for that. But the third level of protection was, we're going to create this nature reserve and we're going to seal it, and no human technology, no drones or anything will ever be allowed in. We're going to leave the area as it is. But we've done a lot of simulation modeling, and we really understand the biology of the bighorn sheep. We're pretty sure that if we do this, those animals will continue to exist and thrive. How much are you willing to pay for that? And the answer, and we're going to seal it forever, right? Not just for you, but also for your children and your grandchildren. And the answer to these questions, to the last question, was still positive. That is, people were willing to protect the bighorn sheep, even though they would never see it themselves, even though they would never have David Attenborough go in with a camera and comment on them. Just the sheer knowledge that these animals existed, people were willing to pay for. This is pure existence value, right? We're willing to pay just for the knowledge that things are out there. This flies in the face of everything a microeconomist would ever do, right? Because we're not consuming it, right? There's nothing material in our consumption, but still, people are willing to pay for this, and I just argued that consumers are sovereign. So if this is in people's utility function, they are prepared to pay for this. This isn't their demand function. Who are we to argue? So those are the two classifications of value, right? One based on the services that it provides, and the other based on the type of the different ways in which we use it, right? Or not use it. Now, we've done value. Now the question, why would we want to do this? Why would you want to attach a price tag to something that is not traded on the market? Well, the reason for this is as follows, right? And there's various reasons for this. If you want to compare the impacts of environmental damage to the impacts of emission reduction in a cost-benefit analysis, and that's what we did last week, right? I said we have the private benefits of using electricity, we have the social cost of electricity, the sulfur and the carbon dioxide that comes out and the particulate matter, and we're gonna add the two up, or we're gonna subtract one from the other, and we're gonna maximize or minimize depending on what we added up and what we subtracted, right? That's what we did last week. And that immediately means that if you're adding up things, you cannot add apples and oranges, you can only add apples or oranges, right? So everything was expressed in their orange equivalent. Now, impacts of a program to clean up the environment is typically measured in dollars and pounds. So the logical way to make this comparable to the benefits of cleaning up the environment is also to express the environmental damage, or in this case the avoided environmental damage, in money terms as well, right? In week 2, I talked about the Pigou tax, that if you want to restore efficiency, we have an externality and that creates a welfare problem. One way to solve that is to levy a tax. And I also said that the Pigou tax is not just any environmental tax. No, a Pigou tax is that tax that exactly internalizes the externality and restores the market to its Pareto optimum. And that means that you need to know the environmental damage at the margin in the same unit as which you impose the tax, right? Which is in pound sterling, or in dollars, or in euros, or whatever currency, right? So if you want to do cost-benefit analysis or a Pigou tax, you have to know the monetary value of the environmental good or service that you're trying to protect or create. There's also a lot of initiatives to pay for environmental services. I have half an hour, so I will come back to this. I talked about the rainforest. The problem with the rainforest is that we think it's valuable. It is, because of the biodiversity and the oxygen and everything. But most rainforest is in poorer countries. And the people there don't think see rainforest as something that is really scarce because it's all around them, right? So they think there's a lot of it. And they have other things on their minds, like feeding their children and so on and so forth. So they have other priorities. So if we want to preserve natural resources in faraway countries, in poor countries, it's us Europeans who care about this, but they control the resource, then one way of doing this, and this is actually more common than you may think, is that we pay for them to protect this, right? To offer alternative employment, to make direct payments for preservation. Again, what is changing hands here is money. And if you want to know how much should we pay them, how much it is worth to us, then again you need to express things in monetary terms. Similarly, if you have wrecked the environment, either of your children or of your neighbors, and they want to be compensated for that, or the courts tell you to compensate them for that, that is more likely, then again that compensation is paid in money. So if you want to determine how much compensation should be paid for the environmental damage, then yes, you need it in money terms. Finally, and this is what we're going to do in week 11, if you want to extend the national accounts, GDP, employment, international trade, and so on and so forth, to also include a measure of natural resources, environmental damage. Again, these things are measured in money. If you want to make them commensurate, you should do it in money terms. The important thing is not listed on this slide, is what is money, right? So what we recall from principles is that money is three things. It's a means of exchange, it's a store of value, and it's a unit of account, right? Here we're using money as a unit of account. It's not that we're putting a price tag on something in order to sell it. No, we're using it to determine the Pigou tax or use it in a cost-benefit analysis, which is a different way of using money, right? It's a unit of account. It's not, we're not monetizing things because we want to sell it. There's a lot of confusion among non-economists that money has three purposes, and they only think, well, if I'm gonna value something, right? If you're gonna call in a real estate agent to value your house, you do it in order to sell it, right? So that is how people see money often, but that is definitely not what we're doing here. So let's look a little bit deeper into cost-benefit analysis and why we need to do this. Cost-benefit analysis essentially weighs the costs against the benefits. So, if we want to find an optimum, then what we need to do is equate marginal external costs to the marginal external, to the marginal private benefits, right? The reason for this is very simple. So simple that it bears repeating. So let's assume that we have something that is measured in one dimension. And what we have very obvious here is that A is greater than B, right? Unambiguous. And if we think that more is better, then A is not just greater than B, but it's also better than B. And if we think that less is better, if we measure it in damage rather than anything else, then B is better than A, right? But it's completely and utterly unambiguous, right? Now contrast that to this situation. No, I'm going too fast. We care about two things. A, we care about this dimension, we care about this dimension. A is greater than B, right? It's greater in both dimensions that we care about. A is also better than C, right? Because it's the same in one dimension. Oh, it's the same in this dimension, and it's bigger in this dimension. So A is also greater than C, and C is better than B, right? Similarly, A is better than D, and D is better than B, right? So those are things we can say. But we cannot say whether C or B or D is preferable, whether C is preferable to D or D is preferable to C. Simply the whole notion of greater than falls apart in two dimensions, right? If we care about one thing, we can say greater than, unambiguously. If we have two dimensions, we can no longer say that. Right? So what we do in monetary valuation, what we do in a cost-benefit analysis, we create a welfare function, W, and that welfare function takes one dimension, let's make it this one here, and we say that is the numeraire, and then we have an exchange rate A that expresses Y in its X equivalent. And then we essentially map this two-dimensional problem to a one-dimensional problem. And we can again say bigger than, smaller than, better than, worse than, right? And there is no escaping this. Last week I talked about multi-criteria analysis, where essentially you make this not a linear function but some other function, right? There's no escaping this. I'm done, but I have 20 minutes left and a lot of slides inherited from George. So What could you use environmental valuation for? For PGU taxes or taxes, and for regulation, if you want to say, well, this is the amount that we want to go for, right? So if you go quarrying, which they still do in Sussex, there's lots of externalities. There's the noise that they make, the dust, the vibration, the water contamination. It, of course, changes the landscape and creates issues for heritage and wildlife. If you want to do this at an efficient level, you need to put a price on this. And that is what the UK government has done. Has done this a long time ago by now. And they said, or they estimate, they essentially commissioned a group of academics in London to do this, and they estimated both the willingness to accept compensation, that is the Hicksian compensating variation, and the willingness to pay, the Hicksian equivalent variation. And they said it for sand and gravel. One came out as £2 per ton, the other came out as £9 per ton. Then they took sort of the safe way out and said we are not compensating people for the damage that we done, because compensating people sort of implies that you accept liability and those sort of things. And they really said, no, we're going to interpret this as we are buying a better environment. And they set the aggregate level to £2 per ton, not just for sand and gravel, but for all materials, because that is administratively easier, right? So they definitely did this. It's very common in the UK, nowadays, England and Wales regulatory environment. There's also a tax on landfill. Landfill generates all sorts of stuff, and not just visual problems. They just look ugly. If you live nearby, it can be noisy and it can be smelly. Also, people put all sorts of stuff in their waste, including stuff that should not be in their waste, that ends up in landfill. So it can be very toxic. Sometimes things are directly toxic. Sometimes things become toxic because they react with other material in the landfill. And there's typically a lot of organic material in landfill as well. And that generates methane, which is a fairly powerful greenhouse gas that changes the climate. And the UK government also imposed a tax on this. Again, they did a valuation study for all these components, and then they added it up and said this is what the landfill tax should be. Now, this is not necessarily a PGU tax, right? But it's definitely an environmental tax. It was intended to be a PGU tax, but the tax that is placed on methane emissions is based on a study that I did in 1996. And even though lots of things have changed in our understanding of climate change and the damages that it does, the tax hasn't changed, right? So it's not a PGU tax in any proper sense of the word, but it is a tax, and it is based on the work of a very young academic. Similarly, we have an air passenger duty, which is ostensibly meant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The air passenger duty is a misguided tax because you pay the tax for boarding the plane. Boarding the plane does not create emissions. It's flying the plane that creates the emissions. And the air passenger duty is the same whether you take a flight from Gatwick to Edinburgh, or whether you take a flight from Gatwick to New York, or you fly to Sydney. The air passenger duty is always the same. The greenhouse gas emissions that come out are obviously different. But they claim that on average it balances out, right? So that is one application of valuation that is real in the sense that you guys, the reason that you have to pay for depositing your waste as you do comes from these sort of studies, right? And if you want to go on holiday, you pay for this as well. So these are real applications. You may also just want to use it to demonstrate the environmental value of things in a sort of cost-benefit analysis, or, as I said, a payment for environmental services. That is, if you want to protect a piece of nature, how much should you want to pay for this? And if the payment is high enough, then indeed you might save the rainforest. And obviously you need to come with a lot of money. I'm not so familiar with this particular literature. A couple of years ago, so you guys are no doubt all worried about climate change, and one solution to climate change is that you stop burning coal and use wind and solar power instead. The problem with stopping burning coal is that coal-fired power plants have a lifetime of 40 to 80 years. Some of them are fairly new, and the owners, if you say, well, stop using this stuff, are going to lose their shirt, right? It's, if you sort of like prematurely retire a coal-fired power plant, then you're several $100 million out of pocket. So one solution to this is that you buy them out. That is, we're going to buy the coal-fired power plant and shut it down, but we're going to compensate the owners, right? That may be considered a fair thing to do. So a while ago, they indeed tried to do this, that sort of through voluntary contributions. We're going to together create a pot of money of 300 million, enough to buy out this coal-fired power plant. Unfortunately, that didn't work because they only gathered about 30,000 of the 300 million that was needed. But the principle is there. Similarly here, this is about the rainforest. Stopping the guy on the big, what you call it, is not going to be easy, right? I've said all this, right? I said this was common earlier. This is now 14 years old. I said it was fairly common. So one thing we are doing is that we're paying, or used to pay, I'm not sure how it's going now, the government of Ecuador to leave the oil in the ground. Two reasons for doing so. If you leave the oil in the ground, it's not being burned, so it doesn't emit any CO2. It's good for climate. But also, if you leave the oil in the ground, then you won't damage the ecosystem that sits above ground, in this case, a pretty biodiverse piece of rainforest, as well as an important river called Pirampiro, right? My Spanish, this is not Spanish even, right? So those things are important. There are issues here. And one issue is how much money can they extract? Because obviously us rich people in Europe think this is important. So poorer, unscrupulous, poorer people can say, I will destroy this unless you pay, right? As a sort of blackmail. And that creates sort of all sorts of issues in terms of enforcement, in terms of things. And this is not a hypothetical example. I talked about CO2, which is an important greenhouse gas. I talked about methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas. But the most potent greenhouse gases of all are HFCs, which are industrial gases. They're really easy to make, really cheap to make. Their industrial value, therefore, is fairly low. But their climate value is very, very high. That is, they do a lot of damage to the climate. And CO2 trades for some 45 pounds per ton at the moment in the UK, per ton of CO2. HFC is 20,000 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. So the industrial value at the moment is 20,000 times 45. That's 9 million, or I may have dropped or added a zero. It's definitely a 9 with a lot of zeros at the end. That's a lot of money for a ton of HFCs, and HFCs are really easy to make. So what a bunch of unscrupulous business people in China did was they built a plant that can make HFCs and said, we will turn this on and vent the HFCs into the atmosphere unless you pay us money not to do this. And the market for CO2 permits and CO2 equivalent permits was such that, yeah, this was a very profitable proposition, and they got paid. What they did was they closed down the factory as they promised, and they did not emit the HFC. They took the machinery out of the factory, plunked it into the building next door, and said, we're going to turn on these machines unless you pay us money not to do this. So this is real environmental blackmail. Is unfortunately, as soon as you create a market, then people will try and abuse this, right? And payment for environmental services or payment for climate services can be a protection racket. Now, some of you are conscious enough, or were environmentally conscious early enough to recall this, the Deepwater Horizon. The Deepwater Horizon was in 2010, which is 15 years ago. You guys were 6, 7? This example is old, right? In April 2010, British Petroleum was operating this thing in what is the Gulf of Mexico, off of the Louisiana coast, and as you can see, everything went wrong. The thing exploded, caught fire, and the one issue with oil is that once you've drilled the well, the oil just comes rushing out, right? Because of the pressure under which oil is formed and therefore stored. And then if you cut through the enclosure, it sort of comes pumping out. So if the infrastructure that captures the oil and sticks it in a tank to be refined later explodes and disappears and catches fire, then the oil just comes rushing out, and there was a big oil spill all along the coast, the southern coast of the United States. Three-quarters of a billion liters of oil were spilled in the Gulf of Mexico. The reason for this is British Petroleum. So British Petroleum at that time wanted to be known as Beyond Petroleum. They wanted to be known as an environmentally friendly oil giant. And they invested lots of money in renewables and that sort of stuff. But they also kept up their profits. And a lot of environmentalists thought this is the future. British Petroleum can make just as much profits as the other oil majors, but be friendly to the environment. The way they kept up their profits was cutting on their safety measures. That's how they cut their costs, kept up their profits. In return, the CEO of British Petroleum was made a lord, right? Because that's how you reward behavior like this. Anyway, lots of damage. And then the question is, of course, how much would you want to pay to prevent these things from happening again? Would it be £5? Would it be £50? That's an important question. Another oil spill. This is the Exxon Valdez, which spilled not as much oil, but at that time it was the biggest oil spill. This was in the late 1990s, mid 1990s. This was in Alaska. This was the first time that environmental valuation got to the courts. Essentially, this was Exxon, now ExxonMobil. At that time it was still Exxon. Caused all this damage because essentially the captain was drunk and that sort of stuff, and perhaps should not have been, and there were not enough safety measures, and there was no backup, and so on and so forth. That they spilled all this oil into the Prince William Sound in Alaska, and then they were taken to court because obviously it was negligence, and then the courts had to decide how much compensation are we going to pay. And for the fisher people, fisher folk, this was relatively easy, right? Because all their fish was dead and they could not fish for 2 years. So what is the lost income? That was relatively easy to do. But then there was all the ecological damage, all the fish that were dead, and so on and so forth. And the state of Alaska sued Exxon to get compensation for the environmental damage. And the sums were quite big, measured in the billions. And this was the first time that environmental valuation studies were used in the courts and that actual damages were awarded based on those studies. A lot of my older colleagues still bear the scars of this because, of course, Exxon countersued, hired a bunch of economists from MIT to sort of say all this stuff is nonsense and you got it all wrong. And it got very, very bitter and very, very contested. But in the end, the court did award damages based on the work of my old friend Carson and colleagues. So these things are real in the sense that, money changed hands. And then finally, and that is, as I said, we're going to do in week 11, if you want to look at economic growth, but true economic growth, that is, you include the damages that you do to the environment, or you subtract the damages that you do to the environment, then you need these environmental damages in money terms, so we're going to look at that. Also, if you want to compare environmental pollution to GDP or things, you need to express it in money, and this is what we're going to do in the very final week. That's it for today.